Welcome back to the StereoNET channel. I'm Paul Sechi and I'm joined today by Bill Lowe, founder and CEO of one of the most iconic brands in hi-fi, AudioQuest. Welcome to Australia, Bill.
Thank you very much.
You've had a long and distinguished career, Bill, and AudioQuest has a prestigious reputation within the hi-fi consumer and retailers going back 45 odd years. Tell us how AudioQuest came to be and a brief overview of the journey from then until now.
There are points along a path, but there was never a planned destination and there was never a transition or a fork in the road. I'm the kid who never grew up and never got a real job, which is an extension of, well, a version of the beginning is as a 13-year-old going away to prep school. I took with me my child's record player, envied the KLH portables systems that all of the other kids at school had, sold my hi-fi, my record player, I gotta remember that language, for $13 US. Long time ago, it was actually like some money, real money. Bought a used one for $25. Learned that there's an amplifier and a speaker and a turntable. There's parts in that one box, and that I could, from Lafayette now Allied used to be the electronics catalogs in the U.S. Buy 7 $1 speakers and 7 $1 speaker cabinets, really high end, to spread around the room in order to be better immersed, to control my oral environment the way I control my visual environment with maps on the wall and posters and things. Just a 13-year-old control freak trying to control this environment. And music is a powerful form of controlling your environment and how you feel. And from there, building Heath kits and Dyna kits for $5, $10 a piece to get the money to buy records, and trading up from used turntable for Garrard Lab 81 to a Garrard Lab 82 and into dual 1219, and that whole progression. It was just a natural, continuous progression and never a plan.
Who inspired or influenced your approach to audio engineering and business? Are there other figures in the audio world that you've learned from?
Well, hopefully if you've got your pores open, you learn from everybody in every form of interaction. Often you learn more from the people you disagree with because they provoke you to think about something and say, well, no, I disagree, and why? So in that sense, many people, including in the hi-fi business, have contributed to my awareness, but nobody would be in the position that you're describing. I've never read a business book. I've spent my life purposefully being a renegade and a rebel, not to any extreme degree, but just not a joiner, not a team player. Don't mean that pejoratively. It's just my peculiar personality and where it goes. Hi-fi was in the zeitgeist quite differently in my youth in the 60s. An incredible surge in the phenomenon of component audio. There'd been specialty audio in the 40s and 50s, or my grandfather had a speaker underneath his desk where he listened to the opera every Saturday or something. But the youthful baby boomer wave that I was part of was just the air we breathed. It didn't have to go look for it. It washed over the population. Not everybody responded as strongly in a particular way as I did, but it was, as I say, in the air that we breathe is the best way I can put it. It wasn't something, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that. And how am I going to do it? Retail, maybe the shortest answer to what you asked is, my perspective is that of a retailer. So I'm a consumer who wants to get high on music being the world's most popular recreational drug, and my generation being a little more willing to acknowledge that than some, but maybe not. I think it's universal. 90% of people respond to music. But music from the late 50s and through to the early 70s went through a rate of change that arguably was unprecedented in the history of civilization. It doesn't mean better music, but just the language of music. Much of music today is using language that was developed in that era from Buddy Holly through Motown, Hendrix, Doors, Joplin, and on. And I'm not just being nostalgic for sort of my period, but I'm saying much of the music today is really a reuse of those words that were invented at that time, on top of classical and thousands of years of human activity with music. In America, I have to be careful. In Canada, I have to not call it America because it's North America, but significantly, North America and the UK have comparatively driven the evolution of music more than other cultures. So, but again, that's my bias, and I'd be happy for people to call me on it and say, no, you just don't understand what's going on in India. It's true, I don't. And Australia is certainly very much part of the British diaspora, and American black music, blues, rushing into white culture in the 50s was this enormous reservoir of a resource that pure white people like Pat Boone were bringing black music into the larger world. The Rolling Stones were a blues band too. The Beatles significantly grew out of black American music. They then took it much farther and never, well, I'd say farther, but differently, or evolved it significantly from there. So growing up inside of that, I was a kid who wanted to get high on music, and that meant a retail relationship as much as I built kits or bought stuff and sold stuff. Being a manufacturer didn't happen until 1978 when I wanted to have my own cable for my own hi-fi store in Santa Monica, California. But I'm a history major, not an engineer. And what I've learned a fair amount about the engineering of audio cables and peripherally speakers and amplifiers and such is there's no larger data set. Somebody who is truly an expert in a field knows a lot from which they draw what they need to be capable in their activity, which is a subset of what they know. I don't know anything more than what I've had cause to learn during the activity as compared to having a specialized education in the area. My favorite part of college was taking sociology, economics, and psychology at the same time. And I was just like, why do humans do what they do? And my interest is in the present, but I became a history major because there were just more courses I was willing to take. But only interesting to the extent that they provide perspective on the present. And I would say that the academic term for such an interest is contemporary anthropology, and the commercial term is marketing. So when people have complimented me on AudioQuest marketing over the years, they're complimenting my being in touch in my own personal way with contemporary anthropology.
We'll touch on engineering a bit later, but we're going to go back to what's your own listening setup at home and how has that changed over the years? And are there any non-AudioQuest components that you particularly love?
Well, I don't make any hardware except for power products.
Yep.
So majority of hi-fi are not things that I make. Then, although you prompt me to say, you might have asked, are there any cables in my system to hard AudioQuest? And there was at one time in the early 90s, Kimber Cable. Ray distributed a 75-ohm digital cable that he did not make himself. But that was better than anything that I had developed in 1993. So yeah, I would not use my own products if there was something better, because my agenda is the personal hedonism. But in that sense, I am very connected, and I was not so successful, but in college I became a retailer. And early on player and what we call high-end today. I was the largest Winsonic dealer in the U.S. in 1975, which is only a couple years after they started. But it does not require any particular kind of equipment to get high on music. And in fact, have been decrying for 50 years what I call the false god of resolution. There's sort of a mantra in our world of audio that if you can hear one more sound that you didn't hear before, then it's a better hi-fi. And the most common reason for hearing something you didn't hear before is artificial illumination, when a speaker is too much like a studio monitor and not enough like a recreational vehicle. So major conundrum about what makes for a successful relationship to music as compared to various definitions of what is an ultimate hi-fi. And they're significantly different. There's overlap, but they're actually conflicting agendas. You asked about my system, so I'm fortunate enough I live to have a home in New York and a home in California, and I take seriously wherever I have music. Music to me is not something you go to and you bring it to where I live, whether it's a car stereo, but I don't change them anymore. It's too difficult and not necessary. But for instance, the favorite system in a way I might say is my bedroom system in New York. Bedroom is where I have time to listen to music before going to sleep and while going to sleep. I don't sit on the sofa staring at a turned off TV and listen to music very much. It's just not part of my life. It once was. Well, there was no turned off TV there either in that center position at one time. But it's Rockport AV2 speakers in that bedroom system. At the moment I'm bouncing between Riviera Labs mono amplifiers and Aesthetics Mimas integrated sources of Grimm MU2. I have 6 Grimm MU2s between my systems and AudioQuest showrooms in Europe and in the US. A remarkable high-value piece. And streaming primarily, although I have 2,500 CDs and they're still important to me. The 4,000 LPs don't get played so much anymore. They're not portable and they're not as handy for going to sleep too. Yeah, silly. But the Rockport Signuses in the California living room, Riviera Labs, larger mono amplifiers and preamplifier, and a Grimm, DJM filters. That's primarily a home theater system. My wife uses it for background music, but everything that I have prized about, I hate to use the word two-channel, but two-channel audio system and the magic of a virtual image applies to home theater. There is a parallel path of multi-channel, which for me, personally, is a detriment and not something I actively don't want. For other people, the attributes of multi-channel is highly seductive, and they followed that path, and they're just as right on their path as I am on my path, preferring a virtual image, which is actually more believable. Ironically, Dolby Atmos is sort of like the rediscovery of virtual, that it's not just how many points you can have, but you have an infinite number of points once you steer between the finite number of points. And you go back to two-channel is actually the most believable of all, because it allows the brain, the imagination, to do the work. And what we believe is more powerful than the truth. What we imagine is more pure than what we witness from outside and try to interpret. And that juxtaposition, I'm getting off. Of my 7 stereos, the desk systems in New York and California, the bedroom systems in New York and California, the home theater systems in New York and California, then there's the system when I travel, which unfortunately last night was my phone on the floor because my Bose Flex is still on Lord Howe Island, and I'd be lucky if I get it while I'm still in Australia. But all of the 3 of the bedroom systems, the Rockports, the Devore Gibbon 10s in California, and that Bose, do the same job. They do the same job identically well, which is that they fill the room with music. They bring music into the room. They don't necessarily bring musicians into the room in the same way at all. But ironically, lying back in bed with the reduction in acuity, sound does not come from your feet out in nature. So our perceptual system is optimized in the horizontal, although we have it also a sense of height. So when you were lying in bed, relaxed and listening to music, and the sound field is only 180 degrees, the brain compensates and treats that 180 degrees, that hemisphere, as a complete world. It doesn't say, oh no, I'm missing, there's this black void. That is our world, and it copes with that world to create a sound field, which in some ways creeps up onto the ceiling, but not really. I have a very good sense of left-right image happening down by my feet. When that is a Bose flex on the floor and I'm not receiving any direct radiated sound, it's all reflected sound. I put it on the floor, usually facing away from me. The brain spends its 50 milliseconds that it takes between our microphone picking up sound, converting it to electricity, and brain processing it through a combination of imagination, algorithms, history, learned experience, that brings us the music. And I don't lie in bed saying, "Ooh, does that guitar sound like the Fender with the right strings on it, or am I being deceived?" No, the music is being delivered to me 100%. And audiophilia, which I am, I'm practicing at it. So I can belittle and make fun of at the same time as celebrate the activity. But all of the systems do an equally good job of delivering music. They don't do the same job of pretending that the performance is happening in my room. And you think in terms of where does music come from? It starts in the head of a composer. And before a musician sits down to play, they have at one time gone through probably a feedback process of noodling around or playing in multiple ways on the piano or whatever, and they've arrived at their preferred starting point. It's like having a file in their head. It's about to be played out. So live music is a rendering of an intellectual intention. We then capture a live presentation, a live rendering, and then treat that as the file to feed a hi-fi rendering. No two live renderings are identical. No two reproductions of that rendering, the rendering of a rendering, no two of them are identical. The significant part, because we're different people at a different place in time, we're hungry or we're not, or we're tired or we're not, the environment, it's too humid, it's cold. Every time we're exposed to music is different. The constant is the quality of the composition, the timing, the quality of the performance, qualities that can be heard on a telephone, which is part of the answer to a very common question, which is, how come musicians don't buy good hi-fi? Well, there's no way that a hi-fi sounds real. They don't live in that fantasy world of thinking the purpose of a hi-fi is to sound real. No, hi-fi sounds real, and it doesn't need to. It's whether it's an effective emotional delivery system, not whether it sounds real. And the attempt to sound real is both an enhancement to the sensuality of the rendering in the present and an obstacle to letting go. The more you're trying to pretend, the more, I use a visual analogy, the more you're looking at a piece of glass to see how well it gives you a view of the mountain, the less you're looking at the mountain and the more you're looking at the glass.
Yeah, very true.
I drift a long ways from what kind of hi-fi do I have. So Rockport, DeVore, Wilson Toontots in one of the systems. I do tend to, because of the multiple systems, there'll be Riviera Labs are in 3 of the systems, Statics Mimes are in 2 of my systems, and Atoll Integrated is in my desk, driving my desk systems. A French integrated amplifier is quite good, but not. The priorities are different. The desk system is a little more focused on articulation, is a little more like a home theater system. The bedroom system is for playing music after midnight at a very low level and having it be fulfilling and magical. And ironically, that $99 US Bose is the only system that has me thinking, it can't be that good. This is not possible. How can it be that good? Because my expectation is here and the accomplishment is actually complete success. How can it do that?
That's a good hi-fi product.
Well, depending on your definition of hi-fi, it's either the ultimate hi-fi product or not.
Yeah, correct. In your opinion, what have been the biggest improvements then in the audio reproduction chain over the 4 decades along with AudioQuest? And do you think that rate of change has sped up or has it remained constant?
It kind of it depends on whether we're talking to from the perspective of the historian who's got more facts lined up about exactly what's going on versus the in-the-moment hedonistic relationship of experiencing music. Software is the emotional provocation. I refer to hi-fi as emotional transportation, the connection system. So it's related to just a slight detour, but I think I'm not off target from what you're asking. The only technical evolution in my lifetime that has changed the relationship and therefore the effectiveness of music being delivered to a human is the Walkman. And the Walkman was the invention of personal stereo, an immersive personal stereo. I mean, I had the original old, whatever they were called, the earplugs and a transistor radio, or a transistor radio under my pillow listening at night when I was supposed to be asleep to, the radio station in New York or something. But the Walkman is complete music being directly injected into your brain. And it did it basically for free. Within a few years of the Walkman being invented, a kid could go down to the drugstore and for the price of 3 cassette tapes, buy the entire system. So that changed the way a whole next following generations grew up. What is required to have this incredible sensation that music can provide. And I prefer speakers. I'm not a headphone person, but that isn't the point. But from the Walkman to the Discman to the iPod to the phone, sure, now there's 75 million or 100 million songs in my pocket instead of one cassette tape. That's irrelevant. That does not change the relationship. And today's speakers and today's amplifiers, today's cables, even more so, are significantly better than what I was selling when I was a retailer in the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 70s. But the effectiveness of the system has made zero progress because it does not require good hi-fi to get off, to hear and receive and be emotionally vulnerable to music. So I'm this conundrum that I live with, which is that it's harder today to put together a really good audio system than it was in, say, 1975 when I was selling the Lynn Sondek. They didn't make tone arms yet, but a Fidelity Research cartridge and a Grace 940 unipivot damp tone arm. Mark Levinson preamp. He only made preamps at the time. A JC2, JC1 AC moving coil stage, into a Dunlop Clark Dreadnought power amplifier, and to Cambridge Audio. That's 2 ownerships ago in Cambridge Audio's history, back when all the good British companies were putting KEF T27, B110, B139 woofer in box because KEF was not making cabinets yet. That was a really great hi-fi. But you could not go as far wrong if I'd used an Ampzilla instead of the Dreadnought or an Audionics amp or some of the other amps of the day. I sold Lexon, which was Bothroyd Stewart before Meridian. They were all good. There was never, now you took a detour and you've now fallen off a cliff. In today's high-end audio, compatibility is actually much more difficult than it was in the lower resolution days, which is, it just shouldn't be that way. There's a language that you're certainly familiar with. When, tubes and transistors, it's less and less different because we're climbing the same mountain, and the better they get, then they're approaching a point of being identical. But that ideal is so far away. It is, as I like to say, it's the North Star. You need a sense of direction. It's not all about, everybody's right. It's all totally subjective. There's a lot of subjectivity involved in the human interface, but there is a path, and there is right and wrong. The same amount of money can buy junk, or it can buy something really good. But junk is actually as effective to someone who's never heard something better. But 90% of the hi-fi out there is inexcusably bad value relative to the best 10%. To me, it's inexcusable. But to the person who buys the piece that costs twice as much and is half as good, and they're getting high on their music, who am I to tell them they're not getting high on their music? There's nothing wrong. And in that sense, the customer does not hold the dealer accountable to sell the best hi-fi, and the dealer does not hold the manufacturer accountable to even be the best brand, because the relationship is so much bigger than just about the fidelity. So if there's higher resolution gear with that's more efficient and has more accurate bass and does all kinds of things better than the system I quoted as being, actually, Cost Electrostatic was my favorite speaker in 1975. But Cambridge Audio was my favorite dynamic speaker. But relative to those products, almost everything I use today is better. But do I enjoy music more because of that? No, that would be ridiculous. That's a audiophile rationalization, just like people make about coffee, wine, and every other time that the human animal interfaces with an intellectual pursuit.
So, Bill, how does the progression of audio technology, and we've touched on this, compare to that of video? So, for example, we're at 24-bit 192 in audio and 8K resolution with video present. What are your main considerations when you design audio cables and video cables?
Well, there is some important distinctions between application, analog video, digital audio, which has multiple interfaces, and analog audio signal. There are overlaps, but also considerable differences in the priority of the ingredients that affect or diminish. Cables don't do anything good. They're only bad. So, not belittling their importance, but relative to electronics or speakers or transducer in particular, a phono cartridge, microphone, or a speaker, cable is simple in what it wants to do. I mean, no speaker can ever be anywhere near like we produce in real life. Cable can aspire to make no change. That's the highest goal, is just simply to be the smallest negative. Cable and power and maybe switches are the only parts of a hi-fi system that I believe should be chosen for their lack of character. Every other product in a hi-fi system has character. It has personality. And I touched in the last question on how critical that compatibility or aesthetic compatibility is, not necessarily electrical compatibility. It's aesthetic. Sometimes it's better to have more of the same type of distortion because that tucks into something that's already there. It's not a new and confusing variable. And other times that particular type of distortion is so detrimental that anything that minimizes it versus increasing it, that's the worst enemy. But cable, it's just trying to get out of the way, and a bypass comparison has always been my ultimate test. And it boggles me. The only reviewer, right up to my experience, I'm sure there were others, who ever harped on and practiced himself bypass testing, was Peter Moncrief. So back in the 70s, I had into the 80s, a newspaper, more or less newsletter, International Audio Review. Peter was we disagreed a little bit. I remember accusing him once, said, "Well, you probably measure first and listen second." He said, "Well, yeah, I probably do. I'm someone who thinks you should listen first, and then you try to correlate as much as what you've heard with measurements as possible. But it takes a conscious effort to avoid the tyranny of what can be measured, that because that somehow makes it objective and more believable, it often, to this day, it overrules people paying attention to much more important variables because they haven't figured out how to measure them yet. So in that sense, I guess I'm making a comment about the audio design in general, and maybe cable in particular. When there's a bypass test, it's inexcusable not to be comparing your product to nothing. You can't do it with a speaker, but you can do it with a cable. And all cable is bad compared to no cable. Digital, that doesn't really work. I'm referring to analog. But you can add, there's wire inside a speaker. There's wire or circuit trace inside an amplifier. And then there's speaker wire. So you're adding a link. There's already multiple links. And a chain, while a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, to apply that analogy to a hi-fi is a total lie. You can't partially apply, like partially pregnant. Audio is an accumulation of sims. And my earlier favorite analogy is that it's like a staircase. And every product, amplifier, speaker, cable is moving you toward a goal of sound coming to your ears, but it is also a step down. Sometimes a little step down, sometimes a big step down, depending on the quality of that particular product. And at the end of that staircase, you're down. If any one of those steps can have a shorter vertical, you will not have gone down as far. It doesn't matter what the other pieces were. It'll be better. Now, will it be financially efficacious? You might spend 10 times as much to make a little difference here and a tenth as much to make a bigger difference somewhere else. Well, that's something we all care about. But say, which is the piece that makes the difference? No, everything makes a difference because everything is imperfect. The analogy that I've moved to that seems to be more attractive to more people, ironically, was given to me by a blind dealer in Minneapolis who described how his analogy was panes of glass. And if they're all a little dirty, and you're looking through, in my illustration that I use online, it's 3 panes of glass, and they're all dirty and a piece of sheet music behind it. Take out any one pane of glass, clean it, put it back, you have a better view of the music. It doesn't matter which one you pulled out, you'll have a better and clean to a better view. So I'm always, for my entire audio life, been trying to tear down this ridiculousness of a hi-fi is only as strong as its weakest link. There can be a financial weak link, just like not having good tires on your Porsche would be a silly weak link. But it's still going to be an accumulation of the qualities of the whole machine that makes it fun to drive or not. So there is a philosophy to audio design, but technology is rarely the key. Loudspeakers are not my area. One of the notable departure points that a designer has to have an opinion about, but a consumer should not have an opinion about, is first order is a third order, fourth order network. There are attributes to a first order that are obviously superior with impulse response. There are attributes to a third or fourth order with not having the drivers overlap that have obvious advantages, especially economic advantages for the cost of the drivers. Is one path better than the other? No. It is the ability of the designer who's chosen one of those paths. How far can they follow that path? It is far more important. So when an audiophile is encouraged, because reviewers do this, to say, well, first order speakers are inherently superior. You should buy a first order speaker. Well, a Richard Vanderstein or a Tom, not Tom Teal, it's his brother, a Teal speaker or Dyne Audio or somebody with first order, they should feel that way, that it's the only right way to do it. But we are at the receiving end of this emotional transportation, wanting a speaker that deliver music to us, should be judging the result and being predisposed to something about the technology is likely to prevent us from discovering what really might be the most effective delivery system. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to try. But ironically, pretending people understand hi-fi is more of an hindrance. It's a psychological lubricant that we need that encourages people to have confidence to act. At the same time, it more often than not inhibits actually focusing on the variable that matters, which is, can you get naked in front of the music and have a good time? Yeah. Or are you going, oh, I can tell it's a first order network.
Yeah. So let's go back to AudioQuest cables and engineering, and we've talked about the economies and I guess best bang for buck. So when we talk about cables and you design cables, is it the cable geometry? Are we talking about the conductors, the material in it? Is it silver? Is it copper? Is it something else? Is it the dielectric or the sheathing? Lead us down that path of how you look at assessing all of those and coming out with what you think is the ultimate cable for that product line that you have.
Well, it is, you didn't ask it this way, so I'm not disagreeing with your question, but there's often a discussion, well, what's the important variable? And they're all important. But in context, a minute ago made a reference between overlap, but distinction between the priorities of cable design for digital audio, digital video, bandwidth difference. Digital audio is actually very low bandwidth when you get into that realm. And analog audio, which is one of a kind, because the supposedly much more difficult, high frequency, what goes on for an HDMI cable and the FRL, and bogglingly complicated. But those are generally modulated frequencies that with the behavior of the frequency is the same. Audio is a 10-octave bandwidth that requires 10 times as much as that to get a square wave. You need to 200,000, not just to 20,000, preferably higher than that. So the behavior across those 10 octaves, materials behave very differently. That's a challenge audio has that makes audio, in some ways, infinitely more complicated than the, quote, more difficult high-frequency transmission methods. And so the role that the metal will have in that is different than it will have at high frequencies. Silver-plated copper, which is what I call tweeter in your face, obnoxious for analog audio, is a very cost-effective way to get higher performance in digital video, even analog video. But the noise dissipation of conductivity of RF frequencies such that they're not capacitively coupled into the audio signal. It might be an analog cable in an analog context, preamp to power amp, and yet it's the RF behavior of the metal is a significant in that how much RF gets into the active circuitry and causes the transient modulation distortion, and has us saying, "Oh, that cable is much too bright." No, the cable wasn't right. The circuit is misbehaving, and our brain calls it bright when we're suffering. It's a kind of a distress call in a sense, which we equate to amplitude, as if this. I really hate it when some reviewer says a cable has a rising top end. It's better than cold fusion as a source of energy if you can get more energy out of a cable than you put in. So, a very good friend of mine, Darren Myers, who now is the head of engineering for Parasound and designer of some of the best PS audio equipment, and designed the crossover in the current Nautilus when he worked for Equity for BMW. One long winter evening, I visited his home, about halfway through 8 hours of just general fun BS. He leaned back and giggled, and then explained that in engineering school, he was taught that to approach a job, because engineering is a vocation and it's a job, and you need to learn how to be disciplined and approach a job, that you work initially to reduce the clutter of interfering variables and get to the heart of what makes the most difference. And what he was giggling about was that what the two of us were doing and having so much fun doing that evening was discussing the perimeter and how can we find more little incremental variables that will help us be better designers. So that sounds, that's like 180 degrees out of phase. And designing a bridge or a building that shouldn't fall down is a very different thing than designing for audio, where it's touchy-feely, emotional delivery system, and the hi-fis are grossly imperfect. And it's the nature of their imperfections that is far more important than the percentage of what they do wrong, but the nature of it and how it interacts with our perceptual system. Our perceptual system is not accurate. It is purposely distorted in order, like for all animals, for us to live long enough to eat and reproduce. Our senses are coping mechanisms. They're not witnesses designed to make us accurate historians. And so the peculiarities of the data that your brain system does not depend on versus the variables that it is most dependent on in those 50 milliseconds of data coming in and then constructing an oral image that can be handed to our consciousness, our peculiarities are as important, I'm just going to say more, as important as anything that goes right or wrong in the equipment. And so one of my pet projects in life, because I just love this world, is saying that the best designs come from people who have whatever degree of solid engineering is required before they can design a speaker, an amplifier, a DAC, a cable. And on top of that becomes science, which is acknowledging empirical experience of phenomena you do not yet understand, but seek to manage. That's what science does. Science is humble. In science, there are no facts, only theories, hypotheses that haven't been proved wrong yet, as compared to, and this doesn't mean that all engineers have engineer's disease, but it is a proclivity of the profession, which is that if they don't understand it, it doesn't exist. And it's true, if you're designing a bridge or a building or something, whatever, you don't go out on a cliff and see if it'll work. Oh, it fell down. I guess I was wrong. But in our world, it's an artistic world of emotional provocation to deliver that emotional provocation that is music. And so engineering, science, and my favorite example of science, now I do understand directionality, but when I did not understand directionality in cable, I would use that as my provocation, like when I was invited to address all the engineers at B&W some years ago and just poke them and prod them, because that's sort of my role in life, is to be a hopefully productive provocateur. To encourage them to pay attention to things they weren't paying attention to be scientists and not only engineers. Directionality is something that is black and white obvious if you allow yourself to listen and then not say it's impossible, I won't listen, which is what they did. But I didn't understand it. So it was like, when you've got something you can hear and you've got a clear preference, why would you not use the cable in the direction that sounded better just because you didn't understand the mechanism? Now, Charlie Henson, one of the most brilliant people ever in audio area, and founder of Avalon, in the mid-90s, Charlie and I would talk about directionality because we both had witnessed it. We'd both witnessed that if positive and negative need to face the same way, it's not like it's a loop, directional loop, which would be impossible. That if you used a speaker cable and the direction that sounded the best was amp to speaker, then that same cable as a power cable would sound best amp to the wall, meaning away from the active circuit. And so Charlie, being very careful, definitely an careful engineering, competent type, precise background, along with living on a frontier and being a scientist, said it's as if there is a mechanism akin to double conditional diode rectification, reducing RF getting into an active circuit, because the sonic signature was like a reduction in noise getting into an active circuit. Now, Garth Powell, who is my designer, I designed everything myself until 2012 when I hired Garth for power, and he's become part of designing the cables and a very, very important part of that. But prior to Garth figuring out directionality, I didn't know what it was, what the mechanism was, which has to do with steering RF energy. But I acknowledged it, and I made cables that I noted that. And actually, it's fascinating. Many of us, Mike Moffat, made a cable in 1980, and as did I, which was, as far as in the United States, in North America, the first company. We were the first who made, for single-ended use, RCA blocks, cable that were otherwise thought of as balanced cables, twisted pair plus a shield, only connected to one end. And which end that shield should be attached at, I chose by listening. And it turns that's the same end, the load end, as for the steering of RF through the mechanism of directionality in drawing metal. So there's consistency, but there will be companies who say, oh, metal can't be directional, but then they make a choice about which end to dump the RF at when they decide which end of the cable should have the shield attached. It's not a new story. It's the same story that had those of us paying attention starting in 1980.
So your company's approach to cable construction has developed significantly over the years. What are the key innovations in AudioQuest's current cable technology, and how do you see that field evolving?
When we brought out our called Mythical Creatures, the top models, Thunderbird, Firebird, Dragon. When I brought the interconnect cables, which first there were power cables in that series, that there were speaker cables, and then the interconnects. At the time I brought out the interconnects, I took out double page ads, covers 2 and page 1 and magazines in order to have the room to play out sort of a history of AudioQuest, and that as proud as we were of the new ingredients that made these cables better than the ones just previous, that actually they were just another small jump, another small few steps, or maybe a short chairlift ride up the same mountain. And that actually the majority of the ingredients that account for, I believe, the quality of my cables as compared to some others, were mostly actually in the first half of 1980 and 1983. And further finessing those variables and better materials becoming available and some increase in manufacturing capability. But the paths had pretty much all been introduced and very little was added. Amongst my paying attention to dielectric and using perforated Teflon tape, putting Teflon where the field is the greatest and polyethylene foam around that, my first interconnect in late 1980. I was paying attention to almost all of the variables very early on. But many of them had come up by, when I say accident, people think, oh, you fall down and you break your leg. You must be more by serendipity, by coincidence. Geometry, you mentioned, a critical one. We had in our business cards, and we have 4 icons, sort of 4 elements thing that we described. The one shows a series of solid conductors. One is a solid conductor, that's a big one. One of them shows a series, which is the relationship between them. One is a donut, which is meant to be the dielectric material. And whether it's the dielectric bias system that I patented, or it's just choosing which material, that's all falls under the dielectric involvement issue. Geometry, I discovered. I was handed a twisted pair as an original recipe design, knowing that a twisted pair is something the telephone system had to use. Otherwise, if telephone used parallel, they couldn't push signal any distance and it wouldn't work. It was just a 1929 Society of Motion Picture Engineers codified you had to use twisted pairs. That was just my starting point. We all have a starting point. And that was included in my starting point, which actually was the result of an engineer and amplifier designer, a company called Quattro Design, and Dave Gore designed the Quattro gain cell DG, Dave Gore 250. For Guy Hickey was the owner of that amplifier, of that company. And he was an audiophile. In 1978, actually I forgot when I had lunch with Martin Collins a few months ago, which asked for having him remind me which year it was he wrote an article in Hi-Fi News, prompted by Gan Haraga, Nouvelle Disson in Paris. Possibly in the Western world, the first time in a Hi-Fi magazine and discussed cable was Jan Haraga. That provoked Martin Collins, who then did some experimentation and came up with finely stranded magnet wire. I used the word Litz cable, but he didn't actually mean Litz cable. But people make the mistake of thinking that it's a Litz cable just because he uses magnet wire. Litz in German means strand. Litz in English is an arrangement of strands such that every strand has the same electrical characteristics, which is a way of reducing power loss in a cable feeding a TV tower or something. It's critical. But anyway, he thought finely stranded Litz cable was a path worth pursuing. Dave Gore went down to a medical supply company in Chatsworth, Southern California, bought some, you could say, industrial level Litz cable from the medical industry, went to a dealer like myself, but not mine, in Anaheim, California. And they took some of this 15 gauge wire, connected 2 of them mechanically to a door handle and an electric drill, created a twisted pair, compared it to the giant 0 gauge welding cable that the store was using for speaker cable, and this little 15 gauge cable was considerably better. And they wanted to have a cable for their own store to sell based off of what they just learned. And they invited me, being an hour away in Santa Monica, not really that much of a competitor, but equally tweaky and weird, to share in a custom order for this cable, which I refer to as a original recipe. So I wanted cable. My ears and eyes were open to have something special for my store, but I had no ideas about how to do that. Other people were following a path that had been blazed, in a sense, by Polk Speaker Company, brought Japanese cable into the U.S., and they called it Cobra cable. And it was a braided magnet wire cable whose underlying philosophy or technology was that impedance matching was important, which for a speaker cable is absolutely ridiculous. But that was what they did, and it was a 9-ohm cable, as though that's how you hook up your nominally 4 or 8-ohm speaker to a load that hopefully is a fraction of that impedance. And when it didn't blow up the amplifier, it did sound really quite good, but it was 454 picofarads per foot. Very high, very low inductance, very high capacitance, and provided no isolation to the amplifier's output, to the reactivity of the loudspeaker, and amps of the day overheated. But then smog lifters from Diskwasher and many other cables copied. Jonas Miller was one of the 4 seminal high-end dealers in the United States in Beverly Hills. M&K is a company today still. Miller and Kreisel. Jonas Miller was the store. Ken Kreisel worked for him. And it was Ken Kreisel did the recordings that Jonas Miller did at the time for Duke Ellington, many excellent recordings. They chose a Mogami cable, which is like a Belden or a Canary. It's a professional company. Professional, in this case, means both competent and not special, because competent engineering is not enough to make good audio products. But they chose a Mogami coaxial cable whose characteristics were similar to that Polk cable, and that's smog lifters. And I just thought this was ridiculous and wanted a better approach, but I didn't know what it was myself as a history major. So thanks to Middleton White and Kemp and Dave Core, I was given this remarkably good starting point that really was the best cable anybody that I ever played it for was aware of it at the time. And it was only 2 years later I decided to go into the business of making cable for other people to sell to other stores. And at that time, a friend of mine from Portland, Oregon, who had been a salesman for me when I had my store in Portland, had a subwoofer. So he was Randy Hooker, RH Labs. He wanted to have a larger cable to sell with his subwoofer. So he said, well, can you take this twisted pair and just put 4 of them together in a single spiral? You won't even have to jacket it. And then you can sell that to me as a bigger cable to go with my subwoofer. So I said, sure. And I made the cable. And being a little bit curious, I then immediately, as soon as I had the cable, compared 2 twisted pairs to the 1 4-conductor star quad, which is how microphone cables are often made. Positive, negative, positive, negative. And wow, the 1 star quad with the same conductors was black and white superior to 2 twisted pairs. And bang, I better pay attention to geometry. And I made up samples with 6 around a core, 8 around a core, 10 around a core. When did it stop making a difference? So the jump from a twisted pair to star quad was a big jump. And then 6 became a further advantage, until it isn't, because the more conductors there are, the more interaction there is between conductors. Almost everything in life is a compromise, following one priority to the exclusion of the other priority. My favorite analogy is a tone arm. If you want the stylus to be able to follow the warp in the groove, or the groove has to go into the spiral, can't just stay in the same place, you want no resistance to the ability of the stylus to go where the groove goes. So the tone arm should weigh nothing. But relative to the movement of a stylus in a groove, it should be backed up by a 1,000-pound piece of lead. But either of those pursuits is not functional. It is respect for both priorities, and the way in which silicon damping can, at certain frequencies, emulate being a solid, while at other frequencies being a liquid, is the fine-tuning of that compromise. But picking out which one's more important would make a dysfunctional product. It's about balance and acknowledging, which goes back to those other comments about cable or any other product. Everything has a price. Sometimes it's just a financial price. Other times it's, well, yeah, you can lower the capacitance, but you raise the inductance. And so those who believe in extreme low inductance make high capacitance cables. And those who believe capacitance is the enemy make extremely high inductance cables. They're both wrong, I'm sorry.
So what's the biggest misconception people have about AudioQuest or about high-end audio cables in general?
Well, there's a difference between naysayers, which is a ever-present phenomenon. The comment page the reason why a lot of publications don't allow comment pages, because occasionally they are forums for interesting people, for interesting things to say. But they're also often too much like Facebook. But skepticism and naysaying are completely different. Naysaying is irrational belief that I know everything. Skepticism, or as in the U.S., there's a famous expression about I'm from Missouri, prove it. That's good. That's healthy. I love skepticism because it means somebody's paying attention. Cynicism is, I can't make a difference. And we all have to have a little bit of that in ourselves. Audio has a frontier that goes past my willingness to explore. Marigold dots, little dots you put around your room. There are many things that people do, which I'm not a naysayer that says they can't work. I'm just saying the perimeter of my willingness to explore stops short of these ingredients. I'm not going to try them all because it's a black hole. You might never stop trying. So when do you stop? And there's not so many people anymore, but for a part of the population, cable is like my marigold dots. It's like, well, I know the speaker's important, I know the amp's important, but I'm not gonna. And you're right. You can mostly use what I would call really lousy cable. You can put retread bad tires on your Porsche, and the engine is still incredible. And if they're having a good time, who might say they're not having a good time? But most people are easily overcome their skepticism that cable makes a difference if given an opportunity. And my fixation in audio as a retailer, so I'm a manufacturer, but the center of my world, when I say that the center of AudioQuest is marketing, it's because I, as a hedonist, want to be in the hi-fi business, and I'm going to need sales people and a sales force to take it to the street, and I'm going to need my insights and all the other engineering expertise I can get in-house with Garth Powell or over other people over the years, and material sciences. But I only develop a product because I think it's useful in my world of audio. They don't like invent something and say, oh, who can I go sell this to? So I'm the person in the middle. And whatever amount of engineering I have, that's not who I am. That's just an attribute, maybe a little more better than the average history major. But I'm a retailer who's making tools. I'm a manufacturer who's making tools for retailers. And I'd like to think that was as simple as making the best sounding product. Unfortunately, hi-fi business is probably better proof that that's not true than almost any other business I know. As I decried earlier, how much variation there is in the quality of the gear in our industry. There's very little benchmarking. Nobody brings out a camera and hasn't paid attention to what the competition is doing. You ask most people in the hi-fi business what else they listen to, and they say, "Well, why would I do that? Or, I know what I'm doing. I'm on my own path."
Yeah. Well, that leads me to another interesting question. So we have both subjective listening and obviously objective measurements matter in audio. How do you balance those two approaches in developing and validating your AudioQuest cables?
Well,
and products.
even someone who's a part of audio, which is much more dependent on measurements of speaker design than is cable. Cable basically has flat amplitude response. If it has too much capacitance and is going between an old tube amplifier with high output impedance into a not high enough impedance load, the high frequencies will diminish. There are some basic electrical parameters. But for the most part, cable's easy. It's flat. Our perception, our interpretation of the damage caused in that interface could very well be as if somebody had taken an equalizer and turned it into a roller coaster. That's how we hear skin effect. If a single conductor is, let's say, a 1 millimeter diameter or larger conductor, the high frequencies seem to be missing, and the upper mid range is pushed at you. Bass is treating mid range as a reference. Upper bass is tight and controlled, impactful, and lower bass is lacking body and warmth. Well, that sounds like somebody took an equalizer and did this. No, the frequency response, you measure it, is dead flat. And the mechanism of the distortion to the data it's not linear, it's exponential, but it's linear in the sense that it's a progression by frequency. The current density is reduced away from the surface of the conductor. And there's a 1-to-1 ratio in the reduction of the current density away from the surface and a rise in the inductance, which causes a delay in time. So the same signal is arriving spread across time, like you touched an oil painting while it was wet or touched a finger painting while it was wet. And I know a lot of great audio engineers, and none of them have ever been able to tell me that we know how to measure that. It's an obvious mechanism that is well understood, but it's not group delay. It's not the energy being moved in time. It's the energy being spread across time. Same thing happens in fiber optic cable. Completely different domain, but the same problem. An LED firing into a toslink cable, 1 millimeter diameter, is spraying light at multiple angles, the most infinitesimal fraction of which is actually going straight in. The rest is like bouncing, like a pool table shot, billiards, bouncing off the sides and taking a different amount of time to get from one end of the cable to the other. And that creates a bandwidth limitation on the receiving end to understand the data that has been spread across time. But these are not the things that are sort of like intuitively obvious. So people who don't make the reach to realize that when they're hearing something and associating it with a change in amplitude, like it's bright or it's dull, it does not mean that anything's actually happened in the amplitude domain. So you measure it and say, oh, I'm perfect. But they're not measuring the more subtle ingredients that either they're not even aware they would want to measure, or they do want to measure, but we don't know. We don't have the equipment for being able to do that. So we have some what are called difference files, because ultimately that is a basket, and it really does not explain what's going wrong, but it is a proof that there is damage when there's a difference and you can hear the sound of what was added in a cable that was not there at the input. And that can be fascinating. I think it was Alan Surcom went around to one of the hi-fi shows in the UK that I was at 25 years ago or so, and was bringing with him like it was 128K files, 256K files, might have been 320, which is what Moog was, which became Beats, which became Apple. And progressively at the lower, more compressed files, the difference became, meaning what was thrown away, could actually be recognizable music. Whereas at the higher levels of compression, it was just noise. But you can throw away a lot and still understand the words. You can take what was thrown away and still understand the words in some cases. But so it's not that I'm against measurements, but all measurements are only as valid as their ability to be correlated with what you hear. And it's really difficult to not prioritize what can be measured over what can be heard. And the word subjective it has just like the word noise, there's two completely different ways it's used in our world. One definition of subjective is, well, if it's human sensory organs in play, well, that's subjective. And we're all different. You can't trust them. But we are the ultimate test instrument, and one can be methodical about using our subjective senses, maintaining a more engineering-like perspective in the process of using our senses. And that's been one of my other big complaints or agendas for my entire history of audio is methodology. I would often be asked, well, what is your reference system? Which is a way, sort of a code for saying, well, what equipment do you use that's so good that you can tell me what I'm going to hear on mine? And so there is no such thing. But what does matter is the methodology of using the system. And I went on the road in the mid-90s, and we still have a version of this we do today. I had a $99 JVC boombox I took on around cross-country travels. So today that would be 500 US, 800 Australian or something. But it was a JVC boombox with a head unit, 2 cassette decks, played CDs, had remote control, ran off batteries, and had 2 detachable speakers. And that whole system was $100. And I would do a run through of cable comparisons. And when I got to at that time, $2,000 Dragon speaker cable of the day, if you're silver, 20 times the cost of the hi-fi. But people having heard that progression, it's better, it's better, it's better, it's better. And then I'd finally let the song play for more than a minute, and they're just so eager to hear the whole song. Either you're tired of it or you're eager to hear. They'd be basking in the music like it was a real hi-fi, because they lived inside that context, and it only got better and better and better, and the music sounded great. Financially, it's not efficacious to put a $2,000 cable in a $100 hi-fi. But I was doing a number of things, which has proven you don't need a good hi-fi to hear the difference. And that a chain is not as strong as its weakest link. It's an accumulation. And when somebody says, well, what's my weak link? They should be asking, where can I spend the least and make the most improvement? Yeah. So that's a kind of weak, but it's not the way it's necessarily properly understood. So subjective, one can be methodical about being subjective. And that is scientific evidence that is useful and informative to the process of design and necessary. A good speaker designer, more so than any other part of the system, has to be an artist. There's engineering. There is acknowledging empirical data, being a scientist, equivalent of using the cable in the right direction, the example I gave earlier, and the willingness to go, in a sense, beyond that, which we might call being an artist, which is in touch with what you hear, and you maintain the ability to act on how you respond emotionally, even though the neurological mechanisms are not completely understood, and the provocation for those neurological, like what's wrong with the sound that makes me hear it a certain way, that interface, will it ever be fully understood? I don't know. It could be like Iris DeMent's song about religion, let the mystery be.